those of you who are watching at home, and those of you who will watch on YouTube. We come to the beginning of part 3 this afternoon, and I will forgive you if you think you've started a completely new story, because nothing is the same as it has been in the past, for the Bible story, or even for the Jews whose story we're following. So we come to session 25, the beginning of part 3, and it's entitled The Persian Empire and the Return to Jerusalem. We'll start with a proclamation. It's written in Hebrew, and it's recorded at the opening of the book of Ezra. And it reads, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem. And any of those among you who are of his people, may their God be with them, are now permitted to go up to Jerusalem in Judah and rebuild the house of Yahweh, the God of Israel, he who is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let all survivors, in whatever place they reside, be assisted by the people of that place with silver and gold, with goods and with animals, besides free will offerings for the house of God in Jerusalem." What a wonderful proclamation. But it's the year 536 before Christ. Babylon fell 2 years previously, and some of the Jews began their return journey to Jerusalem, where they would triumphantly rebuild that temple and live in the city just as their great-grandparents had done before the exile. Their hopes and aspirations were riding high, and they set off with much excitement, cheered on by those who had decided not to go with them. Their leader was Prince Sheshbazzar, a direct descendant of King David. Oh, though from now on, there will be no more Davidic kings in Jerusalem. Times were changing. There would be only one king of the huge Persian Empire. And in the next 200 years, none of these Persian kingdoms would ever even visit such a tiny, insignificant place as Jerusalem had now become. The future would be very different. In fact, I say it again and again, nothing would ever be the same again. Now, the Persian Empire was entirely new. The world had never before experienced such a large amount of territory. Let's look again at the map. There's King Cyrus. If you remember from last time, he had conquered westwards through Turkey as far as Greece. He conquered eastwards as far as North India. And when King Nabonidus in Babylon began to fail, he seized his chance and took Babylon itself, which gave him all that part in red round the Fertile Crescent. It was a huge landmass, and the world had never experienced such a large amount of land under the rule of just one person. And if you look at it, it's huge. Greece to India, all round the Fertile Crescent. Well, massive, massive empire. But the Persians themselves were from a race of people hitherto unheard of in the Old Testament. So I said, everything's going to be new. They were an Indo-Aryan race. Now, we're Aryans, so not so far from where we would be. Their religion had several affinities with Hinduism from India. Their faith was a new one, pioneered pioneered and taught by the great prophet Zoroaster, possibly a contemporary of Cyrus himself, sometime during that spectacular 6th century that I described last time. That's the symbol of the Zoroastrian religion. And if you're lucky enough to travel through Iran, you'll see it everywhere.
Lucky in Iran.
More of that later on. Now, Cyrus didn't do very much himself except conquer. But his second successor, Darius the Great, wisely adopted this new religion in his domains because, as is well established, all new big empires need to promote one religion, to act as an umbrella or glue to unite and hold together all the other religions which exist in their territory. That is, if it's to become a successful and long-lasting empire. So think for a moment. I'll show you a picture. There's the prophet persuading the king that his religion was a good one. And I endorse that. It was a good one. But think away from that for a moment. If you know anything about the history of Europe, you'll have heard of Charlemagne in the 800s. He conquered northern Europe and straightway sent to York Alcuin, the librarian there, to go to Aachen, North Holland, and establish Christianity throughout his realms. And that would be the glue that held his empire together. And think again, the churches, even closer to home. Think of the British Empire, which all the diverse new colonies were very quickly visited by Christian missionaries who set out to convert the people and establish churches wherever they went. And these churches are still bound together in the structure of the worldwide Anglican Communion under the leadership of the Archbishop of Canterbury. But now, and quite naturally, the strains are emerging, particularly among the bishops of some of the newly independent countries of the Commonwealth. And what its future is going to be is a big question. And as yet, we don't know the answer. But nevertheless, that's another example of a new empire needing one religion to hold everybody together. Now, go back to Cyrus. After Cyrus, his second successor, King Darius, sponsored this new up-to-date religion taught by the prophet Zoroaster. He wanted to unify his large empire. And ever since then, it's had a big impact on later Jewish and Christian thinking, which we fail to recognize. We've already met the new apocalyptic style of religious writing in Ezekiel and 2nd Isaiah. And we shall watch its impact growing as we move through this third part of the Bible story. And later in the New Testament, of course, we find it in the Gospels too, and in the book of Revelation. So what is this new religion? Briefly for now, because you're going to hear a lot more about it in future, but just briefly to put you in the picture. Zoroaster taught that there were only two gods in the whole world. God of good and the God of evil, but they were totally opposed to each other, at war. The first was known as Ahura Mazda. Now what do you think of when you think of a Mazda? That's the light. Ahura Mazda, the light, was the God of all goodness working in the world. But the other was Angra Mainyu, the darkness, and of all evil at work in the world. But Zoroaster Zoroaster also taught that every single person has free will, which is not a gift of either God, it's just part of being human. But every single person then is responsible for making their own choices, deciding whether to do good things and earn the approval of our hero Mazda, or bad, in which case Angra Menu was very delighted. But they made that choice without any pressure or demands from either of the two gods. And that, in that sense, is very different from what we're used to. In the ultimate end, though, Zoroaster predicted that eventually goodness would overcome evil, but he made no further comment on that. It wasn't quite the complete monotheism of the Jews in Babylon, but it wasn't far off. And they both developed in that same 6th century BCE. Well, that's all for now. But as time went by, this faith, or philosophy, took permanent hold on both the Persian and the Greek empires to come. And we shall find how its very significant influence affected the popular thinking of Jews, right up to and including the time of Jesus. And of course, Christians have inherited it. Today, the followers of that Zoroastrian religion are known as the Parsis. And if you travel in Iran, or Pakistan, or northern India, you will find Parsi temples. And that's the following the teachings of Zoroaster. Back to our story then. Although nothing, and I'm going to say this time and time again, nothing would ever be the same after the time of Cyrus, little at first seemed to be different. In capturing the city of Babylon, Cyrus had acquired the whole of the Babylonian Empire to add to all his previous conquests. But he was a soldier. He did very, very little to organize this new empire. He merely appointed Damascus in Syria to be the centre point for his new western province, which took on a new name, the province beyond Euphrates. If you think of the map, think of the river Euphrates. That bit beyond that he'd acquired by conquering Babylon is called beyond Euphrates, and that's how it's going to be known in future. It's all you. There are no records at all, I'm afraid, of the journey of that little band of Jews that set off from Babylon. So we must use our imaginations to travel with them. They would have driven in huge carts, probably drawn by oxen, to carry all their possessions and all the gifts they've been given. But it would have been a long and arduous trek all round the Fertile Crescent, as Abraham had done 1,500 years before. There were only rough tracks for roads, so ox and carts had a rough ride. There were no 4-star hotels to sleep in on the way. You don't know how they slept. But the people they met, of course, on the way were not Jews. So, no friends. How they slept, what they ate, we do not know. But we can only guess that those local people, seeing this unprotected group of foreigners coming past their way, were going to make whooping with them and exploit them for as much as they could get out of them. Well, the travellers, however, paid up and persevered. Eventually they passed through Damascus, their old enemy, before moving on southwards towards their goal, Jerusalem. How wonderful it would be. And that wonderful day dawned at last when they finally arrived. They arrived. a shock. They found the city walls still broken, all overgrown and dilapidated. But then, almost in great dismay, they found the places where their family homes had been not empty, but occupied by people who moved into the empty ruins many years previously and established themselves as owners of those houses which they had rebuilt in the ruins. Big shock. Where was the grand welcome? Answer, there wasn't one. What had been the city of Jerusalem was not an empty ruin, only an unprotected ruin, where other people had taken up residence in what had been their homes. And these new residents, of course, treated the newcomers with hostility, unwanted interlopers. They just hoped they could persuade them to go away again. And the new arrivals found themselves stranded. They were forced to camp either on those ruined walls or outside in the surrounding countryside. And then, of course, they had to spend what money they had left on food for their own survival. It was not long before they became poverty-stricken and very demoralized. Their priestly concerns, remember, and the whole purpose of their return had been to rebuild the temple. And this now seemed impossible. Their only achievement was to find the ruins of the old temple and clear the site from all the debris and the grasses and the odd stones left on it. They cleared the site, and having done that, they set up an altar on the cleared site. That was all. But they rejoiced as they began to offer daily sacrifices again, because they were the priests, remember. But that was all. In the autumn, they kept the festival of booths, that is Sukkot, remembering the grape harvests of old. And thus gradually, the long process of restoring temple worship did begin to develop, marking the beginning of Judaism as we now know it. Now there's no more mention of their leader, Prince Sheshbazzar. He just disappears. We don't know what happened to him. Was he recalled? If he was, we don't know why. Did he die? Unmourned? Not remembered? Or was he merely so ineffective that he just didn't count? We do not know. It was the priests who provided leadership, especially in this new community, and eventually, of course, one of them assumed the title of the high priest. We're going to meet that for many years to come. Gradually, over the next 500 years, till we reach the time of Jesus, the priests all assumed great importance in that city. And part 3 of this long Bible story is entitled, very aptly, The Era of the Priests. None of this, though, is a straightforward read in the Old Testament. Understandably, of course, the Jews didn't write all this as part of their history. And we have to scan the records that do exist and try to discern from them what really happened. And then we must use our imaginations to fill the gaps. Sadly, there are no more historical records of the standard of 1 and 2 kings, on which we depended so heavily in the time of the kings and the prophets. This was because all the political records were now written in Persia, far away. And even the local records were made in Damascus, their old enemy. And Damascus, of course, being the central city of the province of beyond Euphrates. And that is not in Jerusalem, which was more politically now, less than a small backwater of very little importance. What a change. I told you everything's going to be different, and this couldn't be more different. The records we do have in the Old Testament were written many years later by the priests when they had re-established themselves. But their memories are somewhat muddled now, muddled into books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And we shall have to untangle those next time. And of course they wrote much more triumphantly, as if thousands had returned from Babylon and all was well. In reality, we can see between the cracks and realise that the returning Jews had to start all over again, and in the middle are very hostile neighbours. Again, let it be said, they could not put the clocks back. Everything would be different. Well, the exile had been an historical and a religious watershed for the Jews, as well as for many other captured peoples. In a very different future, Jerusalem eventually did become the cultural foundation of the Judaism we meet in the New Testament, claiming worldwide allegiance of all Jews wherever they lived, claiming their allegiance with an annual temple tax, payable from wherever they lived, initially in Babylon and Egypt, and later all around the eastern parts of the Mediterranean world, as we can read in the Acts of the Apostles and, of course, in the travels of St. Paul. The priestly Jews did begin to reinstate the sacrificial worship of God, but very modestly in the bare foundation platform of the original Temple of Solomon. But then 10 years passed by. 10 years is quite a long time for no progress. But 10 years passed by without any significant change. But then King Cyrus died in the year 530. His son Cambyses inherited the large Persian Empire, but he was a soldier. Let's have a look at him. That's Cambyses. Bit of a tug, if you ask me. But there he is. That's the best I could find as a representation of him. Not a fanciful one, but a picture of a stone carving of him. He inherited the Persian Empire, but he was a soldier just like his father. He was eager to follow in his father's footsteps and win even more spectacular victories. And he did. He led his armies round the Fertile Crescent, southwards, and then successfully captured Egypt. So here's the improved map. The green is the Persian Empire, going right down to the coasts of Egypt. Cambyses conquered through the Sinai, through Egypt, and into North Africa, Libya. Just look at that vast territory. Well, during that time, King Cambyses and his Persian army travelled up and down the Mediterranean coast, taking no notice of events in Jerusalem, which suggests, of course, that there was no trouble. Cambyses was a harsh ruler, and everyone knew better than to cause trouble. They kept a low profile, as we'd say today, and there was obviously nothing in Jerusalem to alert his attention. But then he died, suddenly and mysteriously, in 522, only 14 years since that little band of priests had set out initially from Babylon. So it's a very tight timescale going on. After his death, there was a short time of political turmoil before one of the army generals emerged as the new king of the Persian Empire, and it was Darius. There. Soldier, yes, but much more than a soldier. And if it hadn't been for Darius the Great, that huge landmass would not have lasted. It would all have broken down and the whole of that area would have been chaotic. But Darius was a genius. He was an administrative genius. You see him there with his pen. Under him, this new, huge empire, which could so disastrously have fallen into chaos, began to settle down and prosper. Like all usurpers, however, Darius had to maintain military authority in every part of his empire throughout his reign. But he is best remembered for his innovative organisation of such a large land territory. He divided it all into large administrative areas called satrapies. There's another map. There's another map here. You've got the same Persian Empire from North Africa, Egypt, round the Fertile Crescent, Turkey, into Greece, and eastwards through Iran, Afghanistan, and northern India. A huge territory with people so very different from each other. He divided it all into these provinces and gave them a special name. They're called satrapies. And each satrapy was ruled over by a satrap, like the governor of the province. But they didn't have much power, I'm afraid. There was a loyal satrap in control of each of those satrapies, and Jerusalem, of course, was in the satrapy of Damascus, the province beyond Euphrates. Well, his administration followed. He needed good road building because there were no rivers for easy transport. Everything had to go by land. Good road building was the key to his success. It enabled speedy and very efficient communication and transport of all the taxes from every satrap to the king himself who lived in Persia. This, of course, not only demanded good roads, but the establishment of staging posts every 15 miles along the roads. What an organisation. Those posts were changing horses very quickly, the odd sleeping facility before they were on their way again. And every satrap knew that he was always under strict surveillance by the king's numerous spies. It was a real spider's network. Often they were in disguise, and the satraps didn't even know who was a spy. And sometimes they were even in the group of travelling traders. Again, he could never identify them. Or if he could, he couldn't get all of them. These spies regularly and very speedily sent reports to the king and told him what was going on that they had seen. So the satraps didn't have much ability to strike out on their own. Now, Darius was not only an efficient administrator, but he decided that his vast territories needed a common language, and Aramaic it was going to be. So that became common throughout that huge landmass, as well as standardising the weights and measures right across that territory. That meant for easy and very reliable, trustworthy trading. Again, everybody could trust each other. What a good administrator he was. And in addition to all this, he's famous for all the grand buildings he erected everywhere. And he had three particular places in what's now Iran, was Persia then. He had three bases. Susa was one capital, Ecbatana was another, and he created Persepolis. At Behistan, in Persia, there is an area of rock face. Can you see the huge rock standing up from the road? It's known as Behistun. And on that huge mount, there are all the records of the Persian Empire carved into the rock. Wow, and we know so much about it. And that rock face is still covered with the records of his achievements. That's the mound. That's how the rocks were carved out to create a smooth slab into which they carved pictures and they wrote in cuneiform writing, all into the rock. That's one bit. That's another, if you went straight up to it, and people do. You see pictures, you see records. Rather like they were writing a book on the rock face. And all in cuneiform, just like that. It is still there today. Visitors to Iran are lucky enough to go and visit. So that's Behistun, with all the records of the Persian Empire. But the ruins today are spectacular, sadly, and I still have a grouse about this. I haven't been there myself. We were all set to go. A friend of mine went in April that year. We were going in July. And in between the two, there was trouble in Iran. The Foreign Office set in and forbade any English people to travel. And then went. It was one of the saddest things in my travelling life. But I'll show you a few of the pictures, because they just look so wonderful to me. Not the beautiful pictures of Isfahan and places like that, but these old places created by Darius. Well, first of all, Darius created a huge tomb on the top of a rock for King Cyrus. And that's the sort of building he was capable of ordering into being, the tomb of Cyrus. Then Persepolis in particular. It's all in ruins, I'm afraid, sadly, but there are the two guardians of the gates of the palace. You can see the sort of size that we're talking about. Immense they are. Look at the walls under the feet of those huge guardians of the gate. The person standing against them would probably have been below the level of the feet of the animals. It is huge. But it was an amazing palace. It was built for peacetime. There wasn't going to be any wars. And everything there is luxurious, or was luxurious. Sadly, it was deliberately destroyed by order of Alexander the Great, the Greek conqueror, when he was in a drunken rage, dying in the city of Babylon. But that's the future. Persepolis. Let's have a look at the ruins as they are today. The huge gateway. There's the sign of Ahura Mazda. Now, that is a sloping staircase. Can you see how shallow the steps are? No fear of a conquering army coming in there. Those steps were slow, gradually rising. And can you see lots of figures carved along the wall? I'll show you more of them in a minute. They were mounting those shallow stairs, gradually getting closer and closer and closer to the throne room. And they would be messages from the satraps. They would be the tribute bearers from all parts of the empire, taking more and more wealth to this huge city of Persepolis. It was massive. There's another view of that staircase showing you the tribute bringers, slowly, steadily. No panic, no hurry. You can imagine the trumpets blowing and everybody making them very welcome because they were bringing great wealth. It was a palace of immense sophistication. What else can I show you? Underneath the walls, you get lots and lots of satraps, all summoned to a meeting with the emperor and arriving at Persepolis. They're the satraps. And King Darius himself sitting grandly at the seat of custom. What an empire. Certainly one to command our admiration, really. But we're going to stop there. We're going to follow the fortunes of Darius and the Jews next time. And I didn't want to start that story, to have it absolutely fresh in 2 weeks' time. And that will be a fortnight's time, the 5th of March. Now, on the table is the introduction to part 3, if you haven't already got one. There's a map of that huge Persian empire, that landmass. There's a whole chronological time chart with all the new kings, Darius, Xerxes, you name it, they're all there, and they're all jumbled up. And I'm afraid that's where our trouble's going to be next time, because we're not sure whether Nehemiah and Ezra are talking about the first or the third Xerxes, or the first and the third Darius. So we've got problems. And I won't start on those this week. But then the last one, of course, are the notes for this week. So you can catch up when you're at home with this new Zoroastrian religion. And you can look it up on Google and find out more if you're so interested. But thank you for coming. Look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Priscilla.